It started with one woman, a yard, and a dream that didn't fit into the cookie-cutter rules of her suburban neighborhood. Her name was Ms. Loretta Green, a proud black woman in her early 50s with an artist's heart and a stubborn streak that would one day shake an entire community. While the rest of the block displayed perfect lawns trimmed to regulation height, Loretta's vision was different. She saw her front yard as a canvas, not a code violation waiting to happen. With her hands in the soil and colors spilling from every corner, she built a place that celebrated freedom, culture, and life. But the Homeowners Association had other plans. To them, Loretta's yard was chaos, an insult to order. What they didn't realize was that this wild yard would grow into something far bigger than flowers and art. It would grow into a legend. Loretta Green had always been different, and in a neighborhood like Willow Creek Estates, being different was rarely welcomed. The subdivision was known for its neatly painted shutters, uniform mailboxes, and lawns clipped so precisely that they looked cloned. On Sunday afternoons, families walked in rows that looked like portraits, and not a single blade of grass dared lean in rebellion against the HOA handbook. But Loretta, standing proudly in her wide-brimmed straw hat with dirt under her nails, never saw beauty in sameness. She saw it in color, in texture, in the messy sprawl of wild things that refused to be tamed. Her house was small but full of warmth, painted a cheerful butter yellow with deep green trim. Inside, quilts hung on walls like tapestries, and the scent of cinnamon and lavender drifted from old ceramic bowls. Outside, however, her yard was still plain. Patchy grass, a narrow concrete walkway, and 2 stubborn hedges marked her place. Yet Loretta's imagination had already taken root. It began in early spring, when she bought her first flat of wildflowers at a local market. They weren't the delicate roses or clipped boxwoods her neighbors fussed over. These flowers were vibrant, unruly, and bold, exploding in shades of violet, crimson, and gold. To Loretta, they represented resilience. The same resilience her grandmother had carried when she raised children on little more than faith and backyard gardens in the South. As she planted, neighbors peeked over fences and muttered in disbelief. By the second week, the yard no longer looked like the rest. Whimsical sculptures made from reclaimed wood appeared beside the flowers. A tire swing, painted bright blue, hung from a tree. Loretta even crafted a tall metal sunflower from scraps of tin, planting it right in the center like a guardian. To her, every piece was art. To the HOA, it was a threat. The first letter arrived in her mailbox one Monday morning, a thin envelope, crisp and severe, stamped with the HOA emblem. Loretta opened it slowly, her eyes narrowing as she read words, like violation, non-compliance, and required removal. They gave her 10 days to restore her yard to acceptable community standards. She laughed at first, setting the letter aside on the kitchen counter. To her, it was little more than paper trying to bully soil and creativity, but the laughter faded when the second letter came, then a third. Each one escalated, warning of fines, threats of legal action, and eventually the possibility of a lien. The HOA, led by its president, Mr. Gerald Whitman, a stern man who seemed allergic to joy, was determined to shut her down. Loretta felt anger rising, but also a thrill. For the first time in years, she had found something worth fighting for, something that wasn't just about her. This was about expression, heritage, and the right to see beauty in different forms. Instead of pulling up the wildflowers, Loretta doubled down. She built more sculptures, painted her front steps in bold patterns, and added wind chimes that sang when the breeze passed through. Every new addition felt like planting a flag of defiance. Then came her boldest idea yet. If the HOA hated her garden, then she would make it impossible for them to ignore its value. She invited a few friends over one Saturday, brewed sweet tea, and walked them through her yard, explaining the history and meaning behind each flower and sculpture. One friend whispered, "This feels like a tour." And in that moment, an idea bloomed. By summer, Loretta printed flyers that read, "Loretta's Wild Yard Tours, a celebration of color and culture." She handed them out at the farmer's market, at her church, and even at the community library. The response was bigger than she imagined. On the first Saturday tour, nearly 20 people showed up. Families, students, artists, and curious locals wandered through her yard, marveling at the handmade art and the riot of color. Children laughed on the swing, while adults took pictures and asked questions. Loretta stood at the center explaining how every flower carried meaning, how the marigolds represented resilience, the morning glories represented hope, and the tall tin sunflower honored strength. The HOA board members watched from across the street, arms crossed, faces stiff with disapproval. But Loretta didn't shrink. She smiled wider, her yard alive with music, conversation, and the undeniable energy of community. The violation had transformed into a gathering place. The tours grew each week. Soon local newspapers ran features about the wild yard, lady, and social media posts began circulating. Photographers came by and families posed for portraits among the blooms. Loretta's home, once just another small house in Willow Creek, had become a landmark. What had started as rebellion was now turning into a movement. And though the HOA tightened their grip, writing harsher letters and plotting new strategies, Loretta sensed that something powerful had begun. The yard wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to the people who believed in it. And that was something no HOA rulebook could erase. By midsummer, Loretta's wild yard had become the talk of Willow Creek Estates. What was once dismissed as an eccentric hobby had grown into a movement that people outside the neighborhood wanted to see for themselves. Cars occasionally slowed down to take photos, and strangers sometimes knocked on her door to ask when the next tour would be. What began with 20 guests now brought 50, sometimes 100, spilling into sidewalks with laughter and conversation. The yard was alive, vibrant, pulsing with energy. But where the community saw joy, the HOA saw insubordination. The HOA board gathered in their sterile clubhouse, walls lined with framed rules and bylaws, their faces pinched with frustration. At the head sat Gerald Whitman, tall, thin, with neatly combed silver hair and a reputation for precision. To him, Loretta represented a direct threat, not just to order but to his authority. His voice carried the weight of a man used to control as he laid out their new plan: fines, legal threats, and public shaming. Within days, Loretta received notice of a $500 fine for non-compliant lawn decorations. She laughed at the absurdity, but when the fines stacked weekly, reaching into the thousands, the laughter turned into simmering anger. Still, she refused to back down. To Loretta, paying the fines meant admitting she was wrong, and she knew in her bones that she was not. Instead of folding, she doubled her tours. When the HOA sent threatening letters, she read them aloud at her garden gatherings, turning them into lessons about power and resistance. Her audience clapped and cheered, and what the board intended, as intimidation only added fuel to the fire. But the HOA escalated further. They filed a formal complaint with the county, claiming Loretta's yard was a public nuisance, that it attracted unwanted visitors and disrupted the neighborhood's peaceful environment. The county inspector came one bright morning, clipboard in hand, only to find children laughing on the swing, neighbors sipping iced tea, and artists sketching among the flowers. He noted nothing hazardous, nothing illegal, and left with a bemused smile. The HOA's attempt had failed. Word of the failed inspection spread quickly, and Loretta's legend grew. Now she wasn't just the woman with the wild yard. She was the woman who beat back the HOA's heavy hand. Residents who had once avoided her now waved when they passed by. Some even stopped to offer words of encouragement. A quiet shift was taking place. People were tired of the endless rules and the fear of fines. Loretta had become their symbol of resistance. The HOA, however, was not ready to surrender. Whitman and his board crafted newsletters filled with warnings, calling Loretta's tours a disruption, labeling her yard as unsafe, and claiming it threatened property values. They slipped the newsletters into every mailbox, dripping with rhetoric about preserving community standards. But rather than isolating Loretta, the letters sparked anger. Residents muttered in frustration, rolling their eyes at the exaggerations. Some even tore the newsletters up in front of the board during monthly meetings. Meanwhile, Loretta's garden was thriving. The flowers stretched higher, colors deepening in the summer sun. Sculptures multiplied, some gifted by local artists who wanted their work displayed in the legendary yard. Wind chimes of glass, metal, and bamboo sang together in chaotic harmony, creating a soundtrack of defiance. The tin sunflower gleamed, brighter than ever, standing tall like a sentinel over her cause. Yet even as the yard blossomed, so did the conflict. One sweltering July afternoon, Loretta came home to find one of her sculptures knocked over, its painted wood splintered in the grass. Another time she discovered footprints pressed deep into her flower beds, the petals crushed and torn. Though she suspected the HOA or its loyalists, there was no proof. Still, the attacks only strengthened her resolve. She replaced the broken art with something bigger, louder, brighter. Then came the lawsuit. The HOA, in a final act of desperation, filed suit in civil court, demanding that Loretta restore her yard to approved standards and pay back the growing mountain of fines. To them, this was the knockout blow. Most homeowners would have caved under the weight of legal threats, but Loretta wasn't most homeowners. She knew this fight wasn't just about flowers and sculptures. It was about freedom, about telling the HOA they could not dictate the soul of a home. News of the lawsuit spread beyond Willow Creek. Local television stations picked up the story, framing it as a David and Goliath battle, one woman and her yard versus the faceless power of a homeowners association. Reporters interviewed Loretta in her garden, cameras capturing the riot of color behind her as she spoke calmly, firmly about heritage, creativity, and community. Viewers across the city were captivated. People began driving from miles away just to see the yard that dared to defy the HOA. The HOA, expecting public support, instead found themselves cast as villains. Their carefully worded statements about community integrity were drowned out by images of Loretta's radiant smile, her flowers swaying in the wind, her neighbors standing proudly beside her. The tide was shifting, and the board could feel it slipping from their grasp. But victory was not guaranteed. The lawsuit loomed, and the fines continued piling up. Loretta faced the possibility of financial ruin if the court sided with the HOA. It was a heavy burden, and at night, when the yard was quiet and the chimes silent, doubt sometimes crept in. What if they won? What if she lost her home over this fight? Yet even in those dark moments, Loretta drew strength from the people who visited, from the children who played, from the artists who contributed their work. This wasn't just her battle anymore, it was theirs. The HOA had struck back with all its might. But Loretta had discovered something stronger, the power of community, the resilience of art, and the stubborn refusal to be silenced. As summer faded into fall, the garden tours only grew. Pumpkins appeared among the flowers, gourds lining the steps, autumn leaves woven into wreaths. The lawsuit loomed larger, casting shadows across every bright corner. But Loretta stood unshaken, preparing for the next phase of the battle. The yard had grown into a symbol, and symbols had a way of outliving rules. Autumn settled over Willow Creek estates like a quiet curtain, but Loretta's yard refused to dim with the season. Where other lawns grew sparse, her garden glowed with orange marigolds, fiery chrysanthemums, and tall stalks of ornamental grass swaying like dancers in the breeze. The sculptures caught the low autumn sun, casting long, dramatic shadows across the neighborhood. What had once been dismissed as chaos now looked like defiance wrapped in beauty. But while the garden thrived, the storm clouds of the lawsuit gathered with undeniable force. The HOA had filed their complaint in the county courthouse, and now a date was set. Loretta was officially standing trial, not for a crime but for refusing to conform. The board called it a case of non-compliance. To her supporters, it was an attempt to silence individuality. On the morning of the first hearing, Loretta stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the simple pearl earrings she always wore for moments of significance. Her face carried the dignity of generations before her, high cheekbones, warm brown skin, eyes that burned with quiet resilience. The garden outside shimmered in the weak morning light, a reminder of why she was walking into battle. The courthouse was buzzing with reporters. Cameras lined the steps and people gathered, holding handmade signs, "Let the garden grow, HOA, come on bullies, and our homes, our freedom." Loretta's neighbors had turned out in force, filling the sidewalks with chants and applause. She walked through them slowly, lifting her head, offering small smiles while inside her chest her heart pounded like a drum. She had never asked to be the face of a movement, but here she was carrying the weight of it all. The courtroom was stark and formal, wood-paneled walls, the flag in the corner, the judge seated with cool detachment. On one side, Loretta sat, with her modest attorney, a young black woman named Ayanna who had taken the case pro bono, recognizing its significance. On the other side, the HOA board sat stiffly, led by Gerald Whitman, their expressions cold, lips pressed into thin lines. Gerald's eyes flickered with impatience, as though this entire proceeding was beneath him. The HOA's lawyer painted Loretta as reckless, accusing her of degrading property values, attracting outsiders, and disrupting the peaceful nature of the community. They held up photographs of her yard, though the images, bright flowers, whimsical sculptures, laughing children, looked less like evidence of wrongdoing and more like a celebration of life. Still, their tone was grave, their words laced with legal weight, designed to intimidate. Then came Loretta's turn. Ayanna rose, her voice calm but firm, and spoke about freedom of expression, about heritage, about the right to cultivate beauty on one's own land. She reminded the court that the HOA's fines were arbitrary, that the inspector found nothing unsafe, that the supposed outsiders were simply neighbors and visitors celebrating community. She held up letters from local artists, statements from residents, even a petition signed by hundreds demanding that Loretta's yard remain untouched. The judge listened in silence, expression unreadable. Each word, each argument, hung heavy in the air. As the hearing adjourned for the day, Loretta stepped outside to find her supporters waiting. The cameras flashed, microphones extended, and she spoke carefully, knowing her words would ripple far beyond Willow Creek. She told the reporters that her yard was not just flowers and art. It was about people being free to live authentically, without fear of punishment for coloring outside the lines. The story spread like wildfire. Local television covered it nightly, then regional outlets, and soon national headlines appeared. HOA takes woman to court over garden, neighborhood beauty or rule violation, the battle in Willow Creek, and 1 yard inspires a community. Social media lit up with hashtags like None Let It Grow and Garden Freedom. Loretta's yard had become more than a local fight. It was a symbol across the country. Meanwhile, Gerald Whitman and his board watched in growing frustration. Their carefully built reputation as defenders of community order was unraveling. Instead of being respected, they were vilified. Their own neighbors, once loyal, now questioned their authority. Attendance at board meetings turned hostile, residents demanding answers, some openly mocking their obsession with control. Inside Loretta's home, however, the atmosphere was not without fear. The legal battle was expensive, even with Ayanna working pro bono. The constant media attention meant little privacy, and Loretta sometimes felt exhausted from being strong all the time. At night, she sat by her window, gazing at the glowing lanterns in her yard, wondering if this fight would ever end, or if it would consume her completely. Yet she pressed on, finding strength in her garden itself. Each flower, each sculpture seemed to whisper resilience. Her grandmother had once told her that black folk survived generations of hardship because they learned to make beauty out of nothing, to cultivate joy in the cracks where none was supposed to grow. Loretta carried that truth with her now. Her yard was not only her rebellion, it was her inheritance. The second hearing brought more tension. The HOA attempted to introduce new claims, arguing that the yard tours created traffic hazards, that the sculptures were unsightly, that the gatherings encouraged unruly behavior. But their evidence was thin, their witnesses unconvincing. One neighbor testified against Loretta, claiming the yard was embarrassing, but cross-examination revealed he was Gerald's close friend and had financial interests tied to property development. The cracks in the HOA's case began to show. By the end of the second week, even the judge seemed weary of the board's exaggerations. Still, no decision was made, and the case stretched on, hearings scheduled into the winter. Each delay kept Loretta in limbo, trapped between hope and fear. Through it all, the yard never stopped growing. Winter pansies bloomed defiantly, evergreen. Wreaths appeared among sculptures, and neighbors brought handmade ornaments to hang on branches. The tours turned festive, with carolers visiting, lights twinkling, children sipping cocoa as they wandered through. The yard had become more than art. It was tradition, community, a gathering place in the cold. The HOA had wanted silence, conformity, and control. Instead, Loretta had given the neighborhood life, laughter, and unity. But as the year ended, the weight of the case bore heavily on everyone. The tension between board and residents was at a breaking point. Some whispered about replacing the board entirely, others about moving out of Willow Creek altogether. The HOA's grip was slipping, and Gerald knew it. Loretta, though exhausted, sensed something shifting. Each day brought more support, more strength. She was no longer alone in her fight. The lawsuit that was meant to crush her had instead planted seeds of rebellion across the community. The courtroom battle was far from over, but one truth was clear. The wild yard had grown into something bigger than anyone imagined. The turning of the year brought an unexpected wave of attention to Willow Creek Estates. What began as a neighborhood dispute had grown into a national conversation about freedom, individuality, and the rigid control of homeowners' associations. News vans parked outside the subdivision, their antennas rising like skeletal trees. Journalists walked the sidewalks, knocking on doors, asking questions. Satellite trucks lined the curb, their generators humming through the night. For the first time, the quiet community was anything but quiet. Loretta's garden, dusted with a thin sheen of frost, became a destination. Cars from nearby towns pulled up along the street, passengers stepping out to take photographs with the sculptures and flowers. Families walked through her yard as if it were a museum. College students stopped to sketch, bloggers posted videos, and one national magazine even published a feature titled "The Yard That Defied the HOA." The article praised Loretta as a guardian of creativity in an era of conformity. But while the public celebrated her defiance, the pressure inside the neighborhood grew unbearable. Some residents embraced the attention, welcoming the tours and the energy. Others muttered about clogged streets, about strangers wandering too close to their property lines. For them, Loretta's rebellion was not liberation, but invasion. The HOA board exploited those voices, framing themselves as the last line of defense against chaos. Behind closed doors, Gerald Whitman seethed. He had spent years cultivating an image of Willow Creek as a polished, orderly enclave, one attractive to investors, developers, and higher-income buyers. He envisioned tidy lawns, quiet streets, property values that climbed like a staircase to wealth. Loretta's yard was not just an inconvenience, it was a threat to his ambitions. As whispers spread, the truth began to surface. A local investigative reporter uncovered that Gerald had close ties to a real estate developer. The developer had been eyeing several blocks of Willow Creek, hoping to purchase homes, demolish them, and build upscale properties. The plan required the neighborhood to look pristine and uniform, appealing to a higher class of buyers. Loretta's vibrant, unruly garden, her yard of freedom and defiance, stood directly in the way. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Residents who had once tolerated Gerald's strict enforcement of rules now saw him differently. The HOA was not protecting them. It was positioning itself to sell them out. Suddenly, every fine, every citation, every letter tucked into mailboxes was re-examined under suspicion. The foundation of trust in the HOA began to crack. At the same time, Loretta's exhaustion deepened. The lawsuit dragged on, hearings scheduled, postponed, rescheduled. Each one required her presence, each one reopened the wound. Though Ayanna, her attorney, fought with determination, Loretta often felt drained by the legal jargon, the endless paperwork, the hovering uncertainty. She carried herself with dignity in public, but behind closed doors she sometimes collapsed into her chair, staring at her garden through the frosted window, wondering if her fight would ever end. Yet the yard itself gave her strength. Even in winter's grip, the evergreens stood proud. The sculptures dusted with snow seemed to glow in the cold light. Neighbors continued to visit, bringing her food, leaving gifts, sometimes just standing, with her for a while so she would not feel alone. The yard had become less hers alone and more the community's sanctuary, a living, breathing protest. The tension reached a breaking point one icy evening when the HOA attempted to blockade Loretta's yard tours. Gerald and a handful of loyalists stood at the entrance to her walkway, posting signs that read, "No trespassing, HOA rule enforced." They confronted visitors, shouting about property rights, threatening fines. The scene grew heated, voices clashing in the freezing air, but Loretta did not flinch. She stood on her porch, wrapped in her grandmother's quilt, watching as the crowd of supporters pushed back. They chanted her name. They demanded that Gerald step aside. They declared that the yard belonged to everyone. Cell phones recorded every second. By morning, videos flooded social media, showing Gerald red-faced and shouting while Loretta stood calm, quiet, dignified. The HOA's image collapsed further. National commentators weighed in, painting Gerald as a villain obsessed with power. Activists linked Loretta's fight to broader struggles, about gentrification, about black communities resisting erasure, about ordinary people standing up to institutions that sought to control them. What had once been a neighborhood dispute now carried the weight of a cultural moment. Inside Gerald's home, frustration boiled. He held emergency meetings with the board, but attendance dwindled as members began resigning. Some feared public backlash, others questioned his leadership. Even his closest allies whispered doubts. The board that once ruled with unquestioned authority was now fractured, brittle, losing its grip. Still, the lawsuit remained unresolved. The judge's decision loomed like a shadow, and no amount of public opinion could erase the possibility of defeat in court. If the ruling favored the HOA, Loretta could be forced to dismantle her yard, fined into submission, perhaps even driven from her home. The weight of that possibility gnawed at her every day. As winter turned slowly toward spring, the garden stirred once more. New shoots broke through the soil, defiant against the frost. Birds returned, chirping in the morning. Neighbors brought seeds and bulbs, planting them together in Loretta's yard. The act felt like rebellion wrapped in hope, a promise that no matter what the court decided, the spirit of the yard would endure. For Loretta, the fight was no longer just about her. It was about everyone who had been told to shrink, to conform, to erase their uniqueness in the name of fitting in. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. They can prune the branches, but the roots run deep. The courtroom battle would decide the fate of the garden. But the soul of it, the wildness, the beauty, the defiance, had already spread, far beyond Willow Creek. And as the community braced for the final hearings, no one knew what the judge would decide, or how far Gerald was willing to go to protect his crumbling power. The courthouse in downtown Charlotte loomed like a fortress, of glass and stone, its steps polished by decades of weary feet carrying burdens heavier than their own. On the morning of the hearing, the sky hung grey and heavy, as if the heavens themselves were undecided. Loretta stood outside the entrance, bundled in a long coat, her grandmother's quilt folded neatly in her arms. Around her, a crowd had gathered. Neighbors, supporters, activists, and strangers who had traveled miles just to stand with her. Their presence filled her chest with warmth, even as the chill wind cut through the air. The case had grown beyond its original scope. It was no longer framed as one woman against her homeowners association. It was now being watched by national reporters, streamed live by independent journalists, dissected by legal analysts. The East courthouse steps buzzed with microphones, cameras, and murmurs of anticipation. People whispered phrases like property rights, gentrification, and freedom of expression. But to Loretta, it all boiled down to one truth. This was a fight for the right to live as herself. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. The vaulted ceiling cast shadows on polished wood, the judge's bench elevated like a throne. The space smelled faintly of paper and old varnish. Loretta sat at the defense table beside Ayanna, who radiated calm, her dark blazer sharp, her eyes steady. Across from them sat Gerald Whitman, rigid in his tailored suit, his jaw set tight. His eyes did not wander to the crowd. They burned only toward Loretta, as if she were the weed he had sworn to uproot. The HOA's case leaned heavily on rules, on the bylaws etched into their covenant decades earlier. They presented photographs of Loretta's yard, taken at angles, meant to exaggerate the chaos. They spoke of declining property values, of invasion of privacy by the crowds her yard attracted, of a threat to neighborhood character. Their attorney's words dripped with a polished condescension, painting Loretta not as an artist or a homeowner, but as a disruptor. Ayanna countered with evidence of community support, petitions signed by hundreds, testimonies from neighbors who had found joy and peace in the garden, video clips showing visitors speaking about how the yard inspired them. She framed the garden not as a violation, but as an act of expression, protected by rights deeper than any HOA covenant. And then she laid out the most damning piece of evidence, the developer connection. The courtroom stirred when documents revealed Gerald's correspondence with the developer, plans sketched to redevelop parts of Willow Creek, projections of profit margins hinging on uniformity. It became clear that Gerald's enforcement was not about preserving the neighborhood, but about paving the way for outside interests. Murmurs filled the gallery, and for the first time, Gerald's composure wavered. Loretta listened, her heart pounding as though drums were beating inside her chest. Each argument for her yard felt like a defense of her very soul. Each attack from the HOA felt like a blade pressed against her roots, threatening to sever her from the land she had nurtured. She kept her eyes forward, gripping the quilt in her lap, steadying herself with memories of her grandmother's wisdom. The hearing stretched into hours, the rhythm of objections and rulings washing over the room like waves. At times, Loretta felt herself drowning in the weight of legal language, her hope flickering under the fluorescent lights. But each time she faltered, she looked toward the gallery. There sat her neighbors, Mrs. Taylor with her cane, the Johnson kids still in their school uniforms, young activists holding handmade signs with painted flowers. Their eyes carried her forward. The judge, a woman with silver hair pulled into a knot, listened with a patience that revealed nothing. Her questions were sharp, probing both sides without mercy. She demanded clarity, dismissed weak points, and cut through theatrics. By the end of the day, when she announced that her decision would be delivered within a week, the air seemed to exhale all at once. The tension broke, leaving behind only silence and the shuffle of footsteps as people left the chamber. Outside, the crowd swelled again, chanting Loretta's name. Reporters swarmed, microphones extended, flashes blinding. Loretta stood on the steps holding the quilt across her shoulders and lifted her chin. She did not speak to the cameras. She simply looked at her neighbors, her supporters, and smiled faintly. The silence carried more power than any speech. That night, alone in her home, the weight of it all crashed onto her shoulders. She sat by the window, staring out at the frost-covered sculptures. The yard seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, as though the earth itself knew it was under judgment. Fear crept into her chest, fear that the judge might side with the HOA, fear that everything she had fought for might be torn away. But beneath the fear was something stronger, a stubborn pulse of defiance, a refusal to bow. Meanwhile, Gerald's grip on the HOA unraveled. Board members resigned one by one, unwilling to tie their names to his crusade. Neighbors whispered in grocery aisles, calling him a tyrant, questioning his motives. Developers who once courted him now hesitated, wary of the bad press. His once ironclad authority had begun to rot, but his obsession only deepened. He believed if he lost this case, he lost everything. The waiting week stretched long, filled with unease. Supporters continued to visit Loretta, bringing meals, planting bulbs in her soil, singing in her yard as if their voices could shield her from defeat. Journalists camped outside the neighborhood, documenting every small gesture, every flicker of resistance. The yard had transformed from a personal garden into a living stage for a larger movement. And then the letter arrived, a notice from the court that the ruling would be read aloud in open session. Loretta folded the letter carefully, her hands trembling. She knew the moment of truth had come. On the morning of the decision, the crowd doubled. Cars jammed the streets, signs waved above heads, Chants echoed off the courthouse walls. Inside, Loretta took her seat, the quilt draped across her lap once more. Gerald sat opposite, his face pale, lips pressed into a thin line. The air was electric, charged with anticipation. The judge entered, her gavel striking wood. The room fell silent, breaths held in unison. Loretta's pulse thundered in her ears as she braced herself. The decision was about to change everything. The courtroom was hushed, the kind of silence that seemed to tighten around the lungs, making every breath feel borrowed. Loretta sat at the defense table, her grandmother's quilt draped across her lap like a shield, her palms pressed flat against the wood, steadying herself as the judge prepared to read the decision that would decide whether her home, her yard, and the years of work rooted in that soil would survive. The judge's voice was calm, deliberate, measured like the slow toll of a bell. She began by acknowledging the weight of the case, how it had grown beyond a dispute over lawn maintenance into a battle of rights, culture, and community. The HOA, she said, had the authority to enforce certain standards, but that authority was not without limits. Property covenants were not meant to strip people of dignity, nor were they designed to serve as instruments of private profiteering. Loretta's chest tightened as the words continued. The judge cited the evidence of Gerald's connection to the developer, framing it as a conflict of interest that undermined the integrity of the HOA's enforcement. She acknowledged the overwhelming support of the community and the testimony of those who found value in Loretta's yard, describing it as a unique cultural landmark, a living piece of art that had transcended private property to become part of the community's identity. Finally, the ruling came. The HOA's case was dismissed. The threats of fines and foreclosure were voided. Loretta retained the full right to keep her garden, sculptures, and art as they stood. The judge's gavel struck wood with finality, the sound echoing like thunder across the chamber. For a moment, Loretta could not move. The words sat suspended in her ears, almost too immense to comprehend. Then the gallery erupted. Cheers, applause, tears spilling down faces. Strangers embraced one another, neighbors clapped until their palms reddened, chants of her name rolled through the chamber like a wave. Loretta rose slowly, her knees trembling but her spine unbending. She looked at Ayanna, who gave the faintest nod, her calm finally breaking into a smile. Across the room, Gerald sat motionless. His face had collapsed into a grimace, the color drained. For the first time, his authority shattered before the public eye. He was no longer the enforcer, no longer the man who bent neighbors to his will. He was exposed, diminished, a relic of a power structure that had cracked beyond repair. Loretta stepped outside into the blaze of cameras and voices, the winter sunlight spilling across her face. She raised her hand not in victory but in gratitude, her quilt wrapped tighter around her shoulders. She did not need to speak. The yard itself had spoken for her. The days that followed turned Willow Creek into something few could have predicted. Loretta's yard became more than a curiosity. It became a pilgrimage site. Visitors poured in from across the state, then across the country. Tour buses arrived. Children darted through the pathways of color. Families posed beside the sculptures. The garden, once called an eyesore, became a legend. Local businesses thrived from the traffic. Cafes sold Loretta's blend coffee. Bookstores stocked postcards painted with images of her wild blooms. Artisans set up booths near the neighborhood to echo her spirit. The HOA, under new leadership after Gerald's forced resignation, could no longer ignore the economic and cultural value her yard brought. Instead of fighting it, they quietly embraced it, promoting the wild yard of Willow Creek as a point of pride. Loretta herself remained unchanged in essence, though her days grew fuller. She welcomed visitors with warm smiles, telling stories about her grandmother's quilt, the meaning behind her sculptures, the resilience of plants that bloomed despite poor soil. She saw in every face that entered her yard a reflection of something larger, a hunger for beauty unbound by conformity. Yet beneath the joy, she carried the memory of the struggle. She remembered the nights when fear gnawed at her, when foreclosure letters threatened her peace, when she wondered if the fight was too great for one woman to bear. That memory kept her humble, reminding her that what she had defended was not Only her own yard, but the right of people to live authentically, even under the weight of control. Gerald's downfall was swift and merciless. Without the HOA, without the developer's favor, he found himself isolated. The community he once commanded now treated him as an outcast. Rumors spread of his attempts to start anew in another town. But his name carried the shadow of defeat, whispered in cautionary tones. He had tried to control the narrative, but in the end, it had escaped him, blooming wildly in defiance. As spring arrived, the yard erupted into its most vibrant display. Yet, flowers in impossible shades of violet and gold stretched toward the sky. Vines curled lovingly around the sculptures, and the quilt, now weathered from years of use, was framed inside her home as a relic of the battle that had defined her life. On weekends, Loretta hosted garden tours, her laughter carrying across the air as she guided strangers through paths of color. But the most profound transformation was not in the flowers, nor the sculptures, nor even the fame. It was in the people. Neighbors who once turned their eyes away from her now came with open hearts, bringing seeds from their own family gardens to plant in hers. Children who once laughed at her sculptures now painted their own and begged to place them among hers. The yard became not just hers but theirs, a communal canvas where individuality and unity coexisted. And as dusk fell on one particular evening, Loretta sat on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the glow of lanterns her neighbors had strung through the branches. Music floated from a nearby speaker, laughter filled the air, and her yard pulsed with life. She thought of her grandmother, of roots that dug deep, of battles fought with resilience rather than bitterness. She thought of how close she had come to losing it all, and how in saving her yard she had saved something far larger. The garden that had once been called a violation was now a legend, a place where rebellion bloomed into redemption, where one woman's fight against conformity became a beacon of joy. And in the stillness of that evening, as the lanterns swayed and the flowers whispered in the breeze, Loretta smiled. Her yard had never been just a patch of land. It was proof that dreams, no matter how wild, could not be silenced. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.